air inside the abandoned boarding house on Elm Creek Road still carries a cloying sweetness that refuses to fade, even though the place has stood empty for more than a century. Locals chalk it up to rotting beams and mildew. But those who've dared to step inside swear the odor is different, thick, sugary, and unsettling, the kind that sticks to your clothes and skin long after you've left. Back in 1854, the building wasn't just another run-down shell. It was home to 43 miners chasing gold in the Dakota Territory. By spring 36 had packed up and fled, claiming they'd rather starve in the wilderness than take another bite of the cook's food. Records from that winter say 7 men died of sudden illnesses. But what's rarely mentioned is that each of them had married the same woman within a single year. No document explains why her heavy iron cooking pot was buried 6 feet behind the house, or how her handwritten recipe book disappeared from the courthouse the same night she vanished. Her name was Martha Sinclair, and her story remains one of the darkest in the forgotten settlement of Deadwood Gulch. Deadwood Gulch wasn't the bustling frontier town history books remember, but a smaller, meaner version of it. A raw patch of canvas tents, dugouts carved into hillsides, and a few creaking wooden structures charging outrageous prices for shelter. Gold flakes in Elm Creek brought the crowd swelling from a dozen families to more than 200 hopeful diggers in 6 weeks. But there was no law, no doctor, and little chance for survival. Martha rolled in from Missouri on a wagon train with little more than a satchel, a massive pot so heavy it took 4 men to move it, and a letter from a husband who she claimed had died of consumption. She was 34, her hair already gray, her hands marked from years at the forge and fire, and her gaze always seemed to rest below a person's chin, as though she were measuring something only she understood. Within days, she had taken over the largest vacant building perfectly placed on the main track where miners trudged back from their claims. Her signs promised clean beds and hot meals. At fair prices, no credit allowed. The place filled instantly. Compared to hardtack and beans, her stews were like banquets. The bread was soft, the eggs and milk were fresh despite no farm within 100 miles, and the meat, always the meat, was rich and savory, unlike anything the miners had tasted. It was Thomas Brennan, once a butcher in St. Louis, who noticed the difference first. He said the cuts were too tender, the fibers too fine, not beef, not pork, not venison or elk. When he asked Martha where she got her meat, she smiled and claimed a woman from deep in the woods traded her deer and elk in exchange for flour and sugar. But Brennan had hunted before, and he knew what he was eating wasn't any animal he recognized. By late April, a new boarder arrived, Samuel Fletcher, a giant of a man with broad shoulders, calloused hands, and a leather pouch that jingled with each step. He would soon learn, as the others had, that the boarding house's comfort came with a price no one expected. Samuel Fletcher had finally struck a promising vein and needed more than just a roof over his head. He needed a safe place to store his growing pouch of gold while he worked the claim. Martha Sinclair seemed more than happy to provide it. From the moment he signed her ledger, she singled him out with a warmth that did not go unnoticed. His meals were heartier, his coffee always hot, and she gave him the best room in the house, making sure it stayed spotless. She drew him into long conversations, asking about his mining work, his family back in Ohio, and what he planned to do once he had enough gold to leave Dakota Territory. For a man who had spent 3 months in a cold tent with no company but his own thoughts, her attention was more than welcome. Within 2 weeks, Samuel was lingering after supper, rolling up his sleeves to help her wash dishes, the two of them talking late into the night. Martha was sharp, well-read, and spoke with confidence about politics and philosophy, subjects Samuel hadn't thought much about since leaving home. She claimed she had traveled widely across the Midwest and picked up cooking techniques from immigrant families along the way, which explained why her meals tasted unlike anything the miners had ever known. Soon the other boarders noticed the special treatment. Samuel's portions were larger. The coffee brewed stronger, and there always seemed to be a loaf of fresh bread or a plate of cakes when he came into the kitchen. A few men muttered about her favoritism, but most were too content with their own improved suppers to complain for long. On May 15th, exactly 1 month after his arrival, Martha stunned the boarding house by announcing that she and Samuel would be married the following Sunday. The preacher who wandered through every few weeks agreed to perform the ceremony, and the event would be followed by a feast for everyone under her roof. Samuel seemed surprised by the speed of it all, but in a place like Deadwood Gulch, time was as thin as mercy. He cared for Martha, and practicality had its own kind of appeal. The wedding supper became legendary. Martha served a stew so rich, so deeply flavored, that men remembered it for weeks. The meat was tender, in a way no one could quite identify, seasoned with herbs no one recognized, and there was more than enough for everyone to eat their fill. Some even joked she ought to write a cookbook before someone else stole her secrets. 3 weeks later, Samuel was gone. He took ill with stomach pains and fever, lingering only a couple of days before the sickness consumed him. Dr. Ephraim Mills, who shuffled between mining camps with more regularity than skill, declared it dysentery, made worse by exhaustion. It was an ordinary enough verdict in a land where poor sanitation killed more men than bullets or cave-ins. Martha's grief looked real enough. She locked herself in her room for 2 days, emerging in mourning black that no one knew she owned. She moved about the house with the heavy silence of a widow undone, and the men tried to comfort her with small tokens and offers of help. Samuel was buried on the hilltop cemetery that overlooked the gulch. The funeral crowded with miners and settlers who had come to think of him as one of their own. It seemed a tragic but ordinary story for the Dakota frontier, at least on the surface. Martha stood at the grave, pale but composed, clutching a spotless handkerchief she never once raised to her eyes. To the crowd gathered on that windy hillside, she looked like a woman hollowed out by grief. But the truth lay far darker. Samuel Fletcher was not in the coffin they lowered into the earth. That box was filled with nothing but rocks and dirt, while Samuel's real remains had been carefully carved apart in Martha's kitchen the night he died. Every usable piece of flesh was salted and hidden in the cool dark of the root cellar, while her heavy iron pot was scrubbed until it gleamed ready to simmer again. Within a week, the boarding house had settled back into routine, the aroma of Martha's stews filling the halls. No one thought it strange that she now favored braises and soups over roasts. The boarders chalked it up to her sorrow, assuming that whole cuts of meat reminded her too much of the meals she once shared with her husband. Then in mid-June, a new face appeared, Heinrich Stoltz, a broad-shouldered blacksmith from Wisconsin who had left his farm behind in search of gold and steadier fortunes. Unlike Samuel, Heinrich wasn't a dreamer chasing flakes in the creek. He wanted to establish himself to build a business hammering iron for the camps. He set up a forge behind the boarding house, and soon everyone depended on him to repair tools and equipment. Martha welcomed him eagerly. A blacksmith was just the kind of reliable man a widowed landlady needed by her side, someone whose skill could keep her operation running smoothly. Their relationship grew quickly, almost predictably, following the same path as her brief courtship with Samuel, but moving even faster. His meals were finer. His room kept spotless, and Martha's door always seemed open for long talks about his work and his future. Heinrich, still aching from the loss of his own wife 2 years earlier, was touched by her care. On July 4th, they were married in a ceremony, folded into the holiday festivities. The boarding house hosted a feast that left the miners in awe. Martha's stew seemed to contain every kind of meat imaginable, spiced in ways no one could name, paired with bread, softer than anything they had eaten since leaving home, and vegetables that no one could explain in a Dakota summer. People talked about that meal for months. Just 3 weeks later, Henrik was dead. The symptoms mirrored Samuel's stomach cramps, fever, then a rapid decline. Dr. Mills, weary and careless, blamed heat and bad food, shrugging that perhaps Heinrich's constitution was simply not suited for the Dakota frontier. Martha mourned as she had before 2 days cloistered in her room, followed by a slow, stately return dressed in black, her face set in a mask of sorrow. Her fellow boarders pitied her deeply. To lose 2 husbands in as many months seemed like a curse, even in a place where death came often. Heinrich's coffin lay in the boarding house before being carried to the hilltop cemetery. Martha claimed she had prepared his body herself, a family tradition from Missouri, and the others admired her strength. But as with Samuel, there was no body in that coffin. Henrik's flesh had been stripped and preserved with practiced hands, his bones boiled clean in the great iron pot until it developed an even deeper, darker sheen. By August, some of the men at the boarding house began to whisper. The pattern was too neat, too precise to be coincidence. After Heinrich's burial, Martha's meals seemed to reach new heights. Her stews grew deeper in flavor, layered in a way that felt almost impossible for a frontier kitchen. The meat she served was always tender, perfectly marbled, with a richness that suggested breeding and care no butcher in Dakota could dream of sourcing. Yet no one could explain how she managed it. Supplies were scarce livestock, even scarcer, and hunting trips rarely yielded enough to feed a house full of miners. Thomas Brennan, with his butcher's eye, couldn't shake his unease. He knew beef, pork, venison. He knew the grain of every cut, the texture of every muscle. What Martha ladled into those bowls wasn't any animal he recognized. Whenever he pressed her for details about her suppliers, she brushed him off with vague talk of traders and seasonal goods. The evasion only sharpened his suspicions. By mid-August, James Crawford had taken up a bed at the boarding house. He was nothing like Samuel or Heinrich. A smooth talker from Kansas City, he had fled debts and bad luck, carrying little but his charm. He played cards, told stories, and had the other boarders laughing through the long evenings. Martha's interest in him felt different too. With Samuel and Heinrich, her courtships had been brisk and businesslike. With James, she glowed. She lingered on his jokes, blushed at his compliments, and walked with him along the creek at twilight as though she were years younger. 2 weeks after his arrival on September 2nd, they were wed. The feast afterward featured her now famous stew. But this time it was unlike anything the men had tasted before. The meat seemed layered with textures as though cuts from several different animals had been combined in perfect harmony. Men who had eaten in big city taverns swore they had never tasted better. James did not live to see October. On September 21st, he was struck by the same stomach pains and fever that had taken Martha's first 2 husbands. He declined quickly, and Dr. Mills once again chalked it up to the filth of mining camp life. He urged Martha to keep a closer eye on storage and sanitation. She nodded politely, then went back to her kitchen. Her next marriage came with unsettling speed. William O'Brien arrived October 1st, an Irishman with a broad back and a reckless streak, willing to risk his life in the most dangerous claims for bigger shares of gold. Martha's interest in him was immediate, and by October 15th, they were married. The pace was too quick even for Deadwood Gulch, and whispers began to ripple through the boarding house. On November 8th, William was dead. The same sickness, the same decline. But this time there were cracks in the pattern. Neighbors recalled hearing a heated argument between husband and wife on the night before he fell ill. Brennan swore he saw Martha slip out before dawn, carrying a heavy canvas bundle, returning hours later empty-handed. And most troubling of all, William's belongings, especially the pouch of gold dust he had been carefully hoarding, were gone. Martha told anyone who asked that she had already sent his effects east to his family in Boston as he had requested before his death. The story was neat enough, but no one remembered hearing her late husband mention such a request. And unlike Samuel and Heinrich, whose possessions remained tucked in corners of the boarding house, William's things had vanished completely. By the time the November winds began to scour Deadwood Gulch, Thomas Brennan was convinced. He was the only man in the camp with the experience to recognize it, whatever Martha Sinclair was serving it was not animal flesh. And if he was right, the truth sitting in the bowls of her boarders was far worse than anything they imagined. The taste, the texture, the unmistakable grain of the meat, Thomas Brennan could no longer pretend it was anything other than human. He had seen it before in St. Louis, when medical schools paid good money for cadavers, and he as a butcher had been called to prepare them. The resemblance was too exact. Martha's special cuts weren't coming from cattle deer or hogs. They were coming from men. Thomas began writing everything down. In his journal, he noted the patterns each time a husband died. The quality of Martha's meals improved overnight. He recorded how she salted, smoked, and stored her ingredients with knowledge far beyond the average frontier cook. Her understanding of butchery preservation and aging rivaled the skill of professionals. And more than anything, he wrote about the flavor-rich, tender, unmistakable. On November 15th, while Martha visited the cemetery, Thomas forced open the lock to her root cellar. He expected horror, but what he found froze his blood. The shelves were stacked with salted flesh, neatly wrapped and labeled in Martha's tidy handwriting. Every cut bore a note, the part of the animal, the date it had been processed, and even the aging time for optimal flavor. The order and precision made the room feel less like a pantry and more like a macabre butcher's shop. On another shelf, he found a leather-bound book. Inside were meticulous records of Martha's marriages, each husband described like livestock, height, weight, muscle condition, and how much usable meat his body had yielded. Notes on which cuts made the best roasts, which were suited for stews. How long the ribs should hang before cooking. The recipes were refined through trial and error, as though she were writing a gourmet manual in flesh. Even worse, Thomas found their belongings, wedding rings, watches, documents, gold dust, all cataloged and stored like trophies. There could be no doubt. Martha Sinclair had turned Deadwood Gulch into her private slaughterhouse. But Thomas faced an impossible truth. There was no sheriff, no court, no telegraph to summon help. If he accused Martha openly, the men might laugh him off, or worse, she might add him to her cellar before anyone believed him. He chose caution, keeping his journal hidden, determined to gather enough evidence to stop her without becoming her next victim. When Daniel Kowalski arrived in late November, Thomas tried to intervene. Daniel was a Polish immigrant with little English, grateful for warmth and food after weeks in a freezing tent. He brushed off Thomas's warnings, assuming they came from jealousy or prejudice. To Daniel, Martha appeared kind, even protective. She guided him through language barriers, taught him the customs of his new home, and made herself indispensable. Their wedding on December 8th was another grand occasion marked by a feast Martha claimed was Polish in origin, honoring Daniel's heritage. The miners joked it was her best meal yet. For Thomas, it was the most chilling. Daniel did not last long. On December 27th, he was dead. But unlike the others, his death was not quiet nor simple. Something in Martha's careful pattern had shifted, and the consequences would not stay buried in the root cellar for much longer. Daniel Kowalski's death broke the pattern. There was no slow decline, no days of fever and cramps. He simply failed to wake up one morning. Dr. Mills, now deeply uneasy about the string of deaths in Martha's boarding house, asked to examine the body more thoroughly. Martha refused, claiming it would violate Daniel's religious customs, and rushed him into the ground before the doctor could object. Then came Robert Chen, and with him a new level of danger. Robert was a Chinese immigrant and a skilled cook who had worked for a large mining operation before arriving at Deadwood Gulch in January 1855. His eye for technique and knowledge of ingredients made him valuable, but also a direct threat to Martha. He could see what others couldn't. Thomas Brennan, by now convinced he was living among monsters, tried to warn him, but language barriers dulled the urgency of his message. Worse, Robert admired Martha's skill. He was eager to learn from her, blind to the fact that he was stepping straight into her trap. Their marriage on January 23rd followed the same script as all the others. But Robert's death on February 14th shocked even Thomas. Robert had been strong and healthy, working beside Martha in her kitchen, yet he fell ill and died within days. This time the cover story was thinner, Martha's methods sloppier. It was as if she believed herself untouchable, so confident that no one in Deadwood Gulch dared question her. But her reign of control was about to falter. On February 20th, Peter Elson arrived. A towering Norwegian, nearly 6'4", with the broad shoulders of a soldier and the sharp eyes of a man who trusted nothing at face value. His military service had left him with habits Martha wasn't used to watching, questioning, noting small inconsistencies. His pale blue stare seemed to weigh every word, every gesture. Unlike the others, Peter wasn't chasing gold. He carried a contract from a Chicago mining consortium to investigate strange happenings in frontier settlements, missing men, suspicious deaths, money gone missing without explanation. From the very moment he signed Martha's ledger, she sensed the difference. She studied his handwriting, neat, disciplined, deliberate. This was a man who had learned patience, a man who measured his actions. When she tried to draw him into small talk, his answers were vague and slippery, revealing nothing while forcing her to show her hand. And when Peter began asking about the boarding house's history, who had stayed how long, and what became of them, Martha's usual deflections about the transience of mining life no longer worked. He pressed her calmly but insistently, with the steady persistence of someone trained to see through lies. For the first time, Martha Sinclair was not in control of the game. And Peter Elson, with his quiet scrutiny and soldier's instincts, might be the only man who stood a chance of uncovering the truth that had been simmering in her kitchen all along. At that first supper, Peter Elson treated Martha's famous stew less like a meal and more like a case study, where the other boarders slurped greedily and praised her cooking as if it were the finest fare west of St. Louis. Peter ate in silence, turning each bite over in his mouth as if cataloging its qualities. He studied the texture, inspected the fibers, and swallowed with the careful neutrality of a man who refused to give away what he was thinking. His compliments to Martha were polite, even courtly, but measured just enough to be polite, not enough to coax her into boasting about her methods. Martha noticed the difference immediately. This time her approach was slower, subtler. She had rushed Samuel Heinrich James and the others, drawing them in with warmth, food, and promises of stability. With Peter, she knew better. Something in his watchful stare and deliberate answers told her he was not like the others. He was calculating, and she needed to calculate too. She began to study him, probing gently for weaknesses, his money, his family ties, his plans for the future. But Peter saw through it. His military service had trained him to recognize a predator sizing up its prey. And in Martha's questions, he heard the same cold arithmetic he had seen in interrogations and battlefield encounters. It didn't take him long to recognize the red flags. A paying guest should be asked if he preferred his coffee strong, not whether he had relatives back east or how much gold he expected to take home. Within days, Peter began digging quietly, asking around the gulch about Martha's husbands. What he heard confirmed his suspicions. 7 marriages in under a year, each man young and healthy, each one dead within weeks of wedding her. The explanations, dysentery fever, food poisoning, sounded plausible at first, but the details the boarders recalled didn't match the illnesses Peter knew from experience. The speed of the decline, the similarity in timing, the fact that Martha arranged every burial herself, these were not coincidences. Thomas Brennan, who had been carrying his own terrible knowledge for months, saw his chance. Here finally was a man who might survive confronting Martha. But he couldn't come out with the truth all at once, too dangerous, too unbelievable. He waited until a late-night card game when the talk turned to the miserable food in other mining camps. Thomas praised Martha's cooking, but then, in an offhand tone, raised questions about her supply. He mentioned his butcher's background, casually noting that the meat she served was unlike any animal he'd worked with. Peter didn't laugh it off or recoil. Instead, he leaned forward and asked precise, quiet questions. He probed Thomas for details, pressed him for descriptions, and listened without judgment. That reaction told Thomas everything. Peter was a man who could handle the unthinkable. Over the next nights, they built a fragile partnership. Through coded remarks at the card table, through side comments that sounded like harmless chatter to anyone listening, they began to share their suspicions. Thomas revealed his observations piece by piece, while Peter added his own findings from the short time he'd been in the boarding house. Together they formed a covert alliance bound by the knowledge that one wrong move could put them both in Martha's cellar. Peter's method was deliberate, systematic. He began by walking the halls and studying the building's design, noting the placement of doors, storage spaces, and the cellar entrance. Every detail might matter: where she could hide bodies, where she might stash evidence, how she controlled access to her private spaces. He knew he was circling a predator, and predators were most dangerous when cornered. Martha Sinclair had killed with impunity for nearly a year. Now, for the first time, someone was watching her as closely as she watched him. And Peter intended to see what lay beneath the polished surface of her kitchen before he became her next feast. The cellar was the obvious place to start, but Martha guarded it like a dragon at its hoard. The lock never left her sight, and she was always on hand when food was brought in or supplies were taken out. What broke the stalemate was Peter's discovery of her rigid schedule. Twice a week, at nearly the same hour, Martha left Deadwood Gulch claiming to buy supplies in neighboring camps. Those absences gave him and Thomas the window they needed. Peter's first descent into the root cellar confirmed every suspicion. The shelves were lined with neatly wrapped parcels of salted flesh, each one tagged in Martha's precise script. Journals documented her livestock in cold detail: weight, yield, the quality of different cuts, and notes on which parts were best for stews, which for roasts. Alongside them sat the personal effects of her dead husbands: watches, rings, papers, and gold organized with the care of a merchant's inventory. It was irrefutable proof. But Peter knew proof wasn't enough. With no sheriff or court to appeal to, he would need to confront her in a way that forced immediate, undeniable justice. The plan he and Thomas crafted relied on timing and spectacle. Martha had to be caught in the act, her deception laid bare before the very men who had been unknowingly consuming her victims. The chance came on March 15th. Peter, keeping a close eye on her kitchen, recognized the organ she was trimming that afternoon. It was a human liver. The differences were subtle but unmistakable to a trained observer, and Martha's sure-handed efficiency confirmed it. She wasn't improvising. She was repeating a familiar task. Peter didn't move then. He waited until dinner, when the boarders were gathered and hungry bowls steaming before them. Only then did he speak, laying out what he and Thomas had found and pointing to the organ on Martha's cutting board. At first the room erupted in disbelief, then in retching and rage, as Peter produced the journals and trophies he had taken from the cellar. The realization that they had been eating their fellow men shattered whatever calm remained. Martha's reaction was worse than denial. She was perfectly calm, almost smug, her voice as steady as if she were reciting a recipe. She explained that the boarding house had been the perfect business. Steady victims, steady customers, and a built-in system for erasing the evidence. She claimed that human flesh was richer, more nourishing, and far easier to obtain than livestock in the wilderness. Her marriages, she said, were simply contracts, ways to secure meat, gold, and property, while maintaining a respectable front. Then she revealed something none of them expected. Producing another journal, Martha confessed that Deadwood Gulch was not her first kitchen. For over a decade, she had moved from settlement to settlement, refining her methods, leaving behind a trail of sudden deaths explained away as fever dysentery or frontier misfortune. Each town had been a testing ground, each husband another step in perfecting her craft. Deadwood Gulch, she admitted, was just the most recent stop in a career of calculated cannibalistic murder. The boarders who had once blessed her for saving them from starvation now understood the truth. Martha Sinclair had turned their hunger into her cover, their trust into her weapon. And the stew they had praised for months was the very proof of her crimes. Martha Sinclair's confession was not the rant of a cornered criminal, but the presentation of a woman unveiling a trade she had perfected. What shocked the men most was how systematic her methods were, every step refined through years of practice. The great iron pot that had stood at the center of her kitchen was not simply a cooking vessel, it was a weapon, a tool of industry, forged to her exact specifications. She had ordered it years earlier from a blacksmith in Illinois, demanding dimensions and features that made it uniquely suited to breaking down human bodies. The pot was large enough to hold entire torsos, its thick iron walls trapping heat and disguising the scent of long, slow cooking. Built-in drainage channels let her skim rendered fat, which she repurposed for lard, candles, and even soap, ensuring no part of her victims went to waste. The heavy construction prevented scorching during the hours-long simmering, required to tenderize human flesh, while the sheer capacity meant a single body could keep the boarding house fed for weeks. Martha explained with clinical precision how she had adapted the butchery and preservation techniques she once learned from legitimate tradesmen. With surgical efficiency, she broke down a human frame into familiar cuts, salting, smoking, or aging each, according to its fat content and texture. Her anatomical knowledge allowed her to maximize yield, while minimizing odors or scraps that might betray her crimes. Even her recipes had been honed through trial and error, discovering which spices dulled the faint sweetness of human meat, which stewing methods disguised its unusual texture, and how to blend cuts so the result felt indistinguishable from beef or pork. The remoteness of Deadwood Gulch had been as important to her operation as the pot itself. With the nearest town more than a day's ride away, there was little chance of swift investigation. Miners disappeared all the time, swallowed by cave-ins, violence, or the unforgiving wilderness. Death was constant on the frontier, and Martha had turned that truth into camouflage. Even medicine worked in her favor. Dr. Mills, like many frontier doctors, relied on guesswork and surface symptoms. She knew exactly how to trigger stomach pains, fevers, or exhaustion that would match his expectations, ensuring her husband's deaths looked ordinary and unremarkable. Perhaps the most chilling revelation was her psychology. In her journals, she described men the way a rancher might describe cattle, by weight, yield, and temperament. Each entry included not just their physical attributes, but their personalities, their habits, their weaknesses. She targeted those who were strong enough to provide meat, yet isolated enough that no family would come looking. Financial assets were another requirement. Each marriage guaranteed her both food and profit. Her carefully staged courtships were not acts of love, but calculated performances. They allowed her to probe her victims' pasts, confirm their lack of ties, and ensure their deaths would raise no inconvenient questions. The ceremonies themselves were theater, convincing the community that she was a grieving wife instead of a predator in plain sight. What chilled the room that night was not only the scale of Martha's crimes, but the cold efficiency with which she had turned murder into a business. She had transformed the chaos of frontier life into her shield, exploiting hunger, isolation, and ignorance to build an empire of flesh, one marriage, one meal at a time. Martha explained her methods with the detached pride of a tradeswoman, and what she revealed stunned the men in that room. Marriage, she said, wasn't about love. It was a ritual, the final step in a process designed to isolate her chosen victims. By drawing each man into her orbit, cutting him off from the rest of the community, and binding him with vows, she ensured that when he disappeared, no one would question her version of events. The ceremony marked not union, but transition from companion to commodity. Her preservation practices displayed a sophistication that rivaled commercial operations. She had perfected curing methods that extended the life and enhanced the flavor of every cut. A single victim could feed her house for months without the quality of the meat declining. The root cellar had been engineered to her design with controls for temperature and humidity that kept her stores in optimal condition. Specialized equipment allowed her to wrap, seal, and label each package as though she were running a legitimate business. The financial side of her enterprise was just as deliberate. Beyond feeding her boarders, she profited handsomely from stolen gold and jewelry. She maintained connections with unscrupulous traders in distant settlements, men who asked no questions as long as the price was right. That steady stream of income not only kept her boarding house thriving, but also funded her relocations from one frontier town to the next. Peter's military background gave structure to the investigation. He and Thomas began assembling a record that could not be ignored. Journals, trophies, preserved remains, all cataloged with the rigor of an official report. The sheer weight of evidence was staggering. Martha's writings didn't stop at Deadwood Gulch. They traced her crimes across at least 6 other frontier towns over the span of a decade. Each entry included names, descriptions, assets, and carefully logged notes about butchering yields and the quality of flesh. The packages in the cellar told their own grisly story. Each was labeled with the victim's name, the date it had been processed, and the dish it was best suited for. The efficiency was chilling. Nothing wasted, every part of the body assigned a purpose. Alongside them lay the personal belongings of her victims, wedding rings, watches, pouches of gold documents that bore the marks of ordinary lives cut short. Some were inscribed with names or messages of love, heartbreaking reminders that these men had families, dreams, and futures before they became fodder for her pot. More disturbing still, Peter uncovered letters and records linking Martha to wider criminal networks. She hadn't been working alone. There were associates who helped her sell stolen goods, forge documents, and craft new identities. These partnerships suggested she was not just a lone predator, but part of a larger, loosely connected underworld thriving on the frontier's chaos. With false names and fabricated papers, she could vanish into a new town, re-emerge with a fresh reputation, and start the cycle over again. Thomas's knowledge as a butcher gave the community the explanation they needed. He could describe in plain terms how human flesh differed from animal meat, and why Martha's stews had fooled them for so long. His words paired with Peter's evidence stripped away the last traces of doubt. The men of Deadwood Gulch understood at last the truth of what they had eaten and the scale of the nightmare Martha had created. Thomas Brennan's testimony became the linchpin in separating fact from hysteria. His background as a butcher gave him the authority to explain in clear and undeniable terms how the texture and grain of Martha's stews matched human flesh rather than any livestock. That testimony, paired with Peter's meticulous cataloging of evidence, left little room for doubt. Still, the psychological shock to the community was devastating. Men who had praised Martha's cooking only weeks before now vomited at the memory of every spoonful. Some suffered panic attacks and breakdowns so severe that Dr. Mills diagnosed them as cases of trauma rather than illness. Deadwood Gulch had no blueprint for a crime of this scale. There was no sheriff, no courthouse, no jail. What they faced was beyond the usual dangers of mining accidents or drunken brawls. Word spread quickly, and soon the entire camp seethed with questions and fear. Customers demanded to know exactly what they had consumed, while others refused outright to believe such horror was possible. The absence of formal law meant mob justice loomed large. Angry men spoke openly of stringing Martha up without a trial, eager for vengeance, and too shaken to care about procedure. Martha chillingly carried on as though nothing had changed. She cooked, tidied, and smiled with the same calm efficiency, as if confident she could still talk her way out of the charges, or perhaps so detached from reality that she no longer cared. Her composure only deepened the unease. Peter understood that unless order was imposed, the camp would erupt into violence. He began rallying the steadier heads, creating an improvised tribunal to ensure that Martha faced structured questioning rather than mob execution. As more miners reflected on their experiences, new pieces of the puzzle surfaced. Several remembered seeing Martha dragging heavy canvas bundles into the hills at dawn. Merchants recalled her unusual requests: industrial amounts of salt heavy-gauge knives, specialized iron equipment. At the time it had seemed odd but harmless. Now in context, it painted a damning portrait of long-term methodical planning. Dr. Mills, humbled by his earlier misdiagnoses, added crucial medical weight to the case. Examining the remains from the cellar, he confirmed without hesitation that the flesh was human. Reviewing the series of deaths, he admitted that the symptoms he once attributed to common ailments now pointed clearly to poisoning or deliberate manipulation. His testimony transformed suspicion into medical fact. These men had been murdered, not felled by chance or disease. The discovery of Martha's correspondence widened the scope of the horror. Letters linked her to accomplices across the frontier, revealing a loose network of criminals who shared information about isolated settlements, vulnerable men, and profitable opportunities. Deadwood Gulch, it seemed, was not unique. Martha had been part of something larger, an organized web of predators exploiting the lawlessness of the frontier. Faced with the evidence, Martha tried one last defense. She claimed the preserved meat came from legitimate sources, that the personal effects had been left behind by boarders who moved on, that the journals were misunderstood. But the calmness with which she spun these stories only deepened the revulsion of her audience. The men who had once trusted her now saw the truth. Martha Sinclair was no grieving widow or unlucky landlady. She was a predator who had turned their hunger and their isolation into weapons, and the crimes she confessed to were only the visible edge of something far worse. Martha tried to downplay the evidence, insisting that her journals were nothing more than dark stories she had invented, not records of actual crimes. But her lies collapsed under the weight of expertise. Thomas Brennan's trained eye made it impossible for her to pass off human flesh as animal meat. And Peter Elson's experience in investigations allowed him to pick apart every inconsistency in her shifting explanations. Their combined authority dismantled her defense, leaving only the raw horror of what she had done. The aftermath in Deadwood Gulch went far beyond the grisly facts of murder and cannibalism. Trust, already fragile in a settlement built on desperation and transience, shattered almost overnight. Neighbors who had once shared meals and laughter now eyed one another with suspicion, wondering if others might be hiding secrets behind friendly faces. The community's social fabric, which depended on mutual reliance in a harsh land, began to unravel. The boarding house, once the heart of the camp, was poisoned by its association with Martha. It had been more than a place to eat and sleep. It was where miners struck deals, exchanged news, and found comfort. Now it stood as a monument to betrayal. Families packed their wagons and left unwilling to raise children in a place stained with such horror. Others feared Martha might not have worked alone, or that her crimes would draw more predators to a community already proven vulnerable. The miners who had sat at Martha's table suffered in ways that Dr. Mills had no training to treat. Many could not stomach solid food, plagued by the knowledge that they had consumed human flesh. Some were racked with nightmares and violent nausea. Others sank into silent despair. For them, every bite of Martha's stews had become a memory they could never escape. The scale of her manipulation deepened the wound. Martha had not only murdered, but built her reputation on it, her celebrated meals, her status as a grieving widow, her supposed generosity. All of it had been theater. Even Preacher Williams, who had solemnized her multiple marriages, was left shaken to his core. His sermons after her exposure dwelled on the dangers of evil cloaked in virtue, and the impossibility of discerning true nature from outward appearances. Practical problems loomed as large as the spiritual ones. The boarding house itself was both crime scene and contamination site. Human remains and evidence were scattered through its cellar and kitchen. The massive iron pot, so essential to her crimes, became a particular dilemma. Too damning to discard, too grotesque to keep in use. When the question of justice arose, the camp nearly tore itself apart. Many demanded immediate execution, arguing that delay was cowardice. But Peter, mindful of precedent, pushed for a formal trial. Only by documenting Martha's crimes in a structured way, he argued, could they protect other frontier settlements from similar predators and uncover the full scope of her network. His reasoning prevailed, though uneasily. Preacher Williams was chosen to preside, despite his personal entanglement. His role as judge was more a necessity than a choice. His training in moral reasoning gave him some authority, and no one else had greater standing in the settlement. A jury was drawn from the adult men, though impartiality was nearly impossible given how deeply the community had been scarred. Peter organized the prosecution, building his case like a campaign. He presented a timeline of Martha's marriages and deaths, laid out the evidence from her cellar, and used testimony to connect her actions with patterns stretching back years. The physical evidence spoke volumes, but the case hinged on credibility. Here, Thomas Brennan's role was decisive. With the calm authority of a professional butcher, he explained the differences between animal and human flesh, described the unmistakable techniques Martha had used, and gave the jurors the knowledge they needed to see the truth for themselves. It was not just a trial of Martha Sinclair. It was a reckoning for Deadwood Gulch, a frontier community forced to confront the darkness it had unknowingly harbored at its very heart. Thomas Brennan's testimony became the backbone of the prosecution, not only for its technical accuracy, but for the story it told of slow dawning realization. He described how his suspicions had grown over months of quiet observation, how he had recognized the telltale texture of human flesh, and how his eventual discovery in the root cellar confirmed the unthinkable. His account explained to the jurors why Martha had been able to operate undetected for so long, because her crimes were masked by routine, by grief well performed, and by the harsh conditions of frontier life that made sudden death all too believable. Handling the evidence presented its own challenges. The preserved remains from the cellar had to be documented carefully, their labels and packaging shown to the jury. But the gruesome display was moderated to avoid breaking the already fragile psyche of the community. The journals were more damning still, but they created a moral dilemma. To prove guilt, Peter had to read passages aloud, clinical notes about butchering recipes and victim yields, yet every word risked planting ideas in the wrong minds. The balance between justice and caution weighed heavily over the proceedings. No one in Deadwood Gulch volunteered to defend Martha. The thought of arguing for her innocence was unthinkable. The only defense raised was whether she could be considered sane or whether such systematic cruelty proved insanity. But her meticulous planning, her deliberate pattern of victim selection, and her rational explanations, under questioning, all undermined any plea of madness. Martha was not deranged, she was calculating. The trial began on March 26, 1855, in the settlement's largest warehouse, hastily converted into a courtroom. Every adult in Deadwood Gulch attended, their faces lined with suspicion, fear, and revulsion. Peter's opening statement was precise and relentless. He laid out the charges with the discipline of a military officer, giving a report framing Martha not as a victim of circumstance, but as a predator who had operated with chilling intent. His purpose was clear: to ensure no sympathy could blur the truth. Day 1 established the timeline. Witnesses described the pattern with eerie consistency. A new man arriving, Martha's swift courtship marriage within weeks, then sudden illness and death. Each story taken alone might be coincidence. Strung together, they revealed a machine-like cycle of predation. Day 2 belonged to Thomas Brennan. With steady authority, he explained his background as a butcher and how that knowledge had first alerted him to the unnatural quality of Martha's stews. His detailed descriptions of the differences between human and animal flesh made the jurors shift uneasily, but it left no doubt. His retelling of breaking into the cellar, of finding the labeled packages and personal effects, was gripping and horrifying, the kind of evidence no jury could dismiss. On the third day, other townsfolk testified. Miners recounted bundles carried into the hills. Merchants remembered her odd supply requests, and Dr. Mills admitted his grave mistakes. He confessed that Martha's careful manipulation of symptoms had misled him into diagnosing dysentery fever or food poisoning, when in fact she had been staging deaths. His acknowledgement of failure gave weight to the accusations, proof that Martha had used the weaknesses of frontier medicine to her advantage. The fourth day centered on the journals. Page after page revealed not just crimes in Deadwood Gulch, but a pattern extending back years. Martha had perfected her methods across multiple settlements, moving on when suspicion grew. The entries were read selectively enough to demonstrate the scope of her enterprise, while sparing the community the most grotesque details. The effect was devastating. Jurors shifted in their seats, men covered their mouths, and women left the warehouse in tears. Martha herself remained eerily calm throughout. She offered no testimony, no defense beyond the vague claim that her journals were fiction. Her composure made her seem either resigned to her fate or convinced she would somehow escape it. To the community, that calm was more terrifying than hysteria. It was the face of someone who believed her crimes had been not only justified but necessary. By the end of the fourth day, the case against her was overwhelming. The trial was not simply about Martha Sinclair anymore. It was about proving that law and order, however fragile, could exist in a place where chaos had reigned. The jurors and all of Deadwood Gulch were preparing for a verdict that would mark the settlement forever. Martha Sinclair sat through her trial as if the horror belonged to someone else. When neighbors described the agony of her victims and the betrayal felt by those who had eaten at her table, she showed no flicker of emotion. Peter's closing argument stripped away any lingering doubts, framing her actions as not just murder, but a calculated system of cannibalism that demanded the strongest response the community could deliver. He stressed that justice here would echo beyond Deadwood Gulch, warning other frontier settlements that such evil could take root wherever isolation and lawlessness reigned. The jury did not deliberate long. Less than 2 hours after withdrawing, they returned with a guilty verdict on every charge. The announcement was met not with celebration, but with a heavy silence, relief mingled with disbelief that such crimes had unfolded in their midst. The sentencing phase gave the people of Deadwood Gulch a voice. Survivors spoke of the trauma of realizing they had consumed human flesh, of the collapse of trust that made it impossible to look at one another without suspicion. Their words left little doubt The death penalty was the only verdict the settlement could accept. Circuit Preacher Williams delivered the sentence with visible strain. He admitted that Martha's crimes defied the usual categories of sin and redemption, but he insisted that justice on earth was necessary to protect the living. His declaration that Martha would hang at dawn drew solemn nods from the crowd. True to form, Martha received the sentence without a plea for mercy or even a sign of fear. Her only request, that her iron cooking pot be destroyed so no one else could use it, was swiftly granted. At first light, on March 31st, 1855, the entire settlement gathered to witness the execution. The hanging was conducted with dignity rather than spectacle, Williams offering a brief service centered on justice and protection, not forgiveness. Martha's final words were as chilling as her composure. She admitted no guilt, offered no apologies, and instead warned that others like her existed across the frontier, thriving in the gaps, where law and order had not yet reached. Her warning ensured that even in death, she cast a shadow of fear over those who listened. Afterward, the community turned to erasing every trace of her. The massive pot was shattered with hammers and chisels, its pieces scattered across the territory so it could never again be assembled. The boarding house, once the heart of Deadwood Gulch, was dismantled and burned to ash. The cellar that had held the preserved remains of her victims was filled with rock and sealed. Within days, only foundation stones marked where the house had stood. But the physical destruction could not undo the psychological scars. Families abandoned Deadwood Gulch, unwilling to live in a place where they had been tricked into cannibalism. Those who remained struggled with paranoia, seeing in every neighbor the possibility of hidden darkness. Dr. Mills documented what he had seen and failed to see, sending reports to territorial authorities that helped shape new protocols for investigating suspicious deaths and training doctors in remote communities. His lessons spread farther than Deadwood, making it harder for future predators to hide behind the accidents of frontier life. Within 6 months, Deadwood Gulch was gone. The town that had once grown out of gold fever and false hope collapsed under the weight of betrayal. What Martha Sinclair had built through murder and deceit did not just consume her victims, it consumed the settlement itself, leaving only stones and stories where a community had once stood.